Welcome back to Chem Fitness Professional. This is another hybrid circuit tutorial video, and I had a little trouble with the footage on this one. This was pre-COVID scare. It was right as the gym was closing, so it was a kind of improv session, but I have a single leg hip thrust as my lower body exercise, and a single arm overhead press from the seated position as the upper body exercise. And then the third exercise is a Turkish Half Get Up. It's the bottom half of the Get Up, which is really just a rotational movement through the hips and the core while stabilizing the belt overhead. And it's a challenging position. I really like it. It works the core, but it's also just metabolically taxing. And so I'm doing 3 sets here through. This is my second round, I believe. So I've added the rep to each exercise. I think I'm doing 6 on the bell. Let's take a look here. Yeah, and 6 on my get-ups. And then I think I was going 9 on the single leg hip thrust. So I was going 8 each leg, and then 5 and 5 on the arms the first round. And then I went 9, 6, 6. The height position of the implement I'm using there for a seat for both the single leg hip thrust and the seated overhead press. Again, like I said, this was improv, so I just chose that height. I could get higher for sure on my hip thrust and maybe get a little more range of motion, get a few more percentage points out of the work done in that single leg hip thrust. But just for the sake of time, we were closing down, so I just grabbed one bell out of the room and I said, okay, how can I make this a full body exercise that challenges my strength, my balance, my core, and my whole body, and gives me a good metabolic stimulus. So I take a lower body exercise, an upper body exercise, and a core exercise, throw it together, go 3 rounds through, rest, add a rep to each one, and then go 3 rounds through again. So that's why I developed this system, is because of the convenience and flexibility it allows you when you're doing your programming. This wasn't what I had in mind for this session per se, but I knew I came in and I wanted to do a vertical push and a single leg hip dominant movement. So if I know the movement pattern, I can just plug into the movement pattern different exercises that will fit the tools that I have, depending on if I have cables or bands or kettlebells or barbells. I just implement the different tools into the different movement patterns that I want to work, the major movement patterns. Go watch that tutorial video if you haven't seen it already, where you'll be able to get a little more sense of how to do your own programming on the fly, where you just, as long as you're working the major movement patterns, you're getting the majority of the body the work it needs done the most to maintain balance and optimal performance. The real key here on these hip thrusts is just the position of the rib cage and the pelvis. Really make sure you're getting that pelvic tuck and keeping the ribs laced down, so that way you've got a stiff trunk and you're doing all the work with your hamstring and your glute. This seated press, I do like this variation where you're seated at the front of a bench. The key concern here is just make sure that you have the ability to brace through your core and keep the rib cage from flaring up, so that way you're not hinging on that mid-back pivot point from the bottom of the rib cage and the top of the low back. And I would add to that, just make sure that you have the ability to get that shoulder comfortably up overhead with load without any kind of major compensations. If so, then you would just regress to an easier position, potentially half kneeling, or maybe a landmine overhead press, something that doesn't require as much shoulder flexion, overhead control, and range of motion. This Turkish Get Up Roll here, I'm just following through the very first few cues of the Turkish Get Up. Watch my Get Up tutorial series if you want to learn that exercise in detail and how to do it efficiently. It is a good exercise. It's not a necessary exercise, but it is a great exercise. I do think it's underrated for how much work you can get done using it, and the ability it has to fill a lot of holes in training programs. But I'm basically going from the back to the elbow, from the elbow to the hand. That's my first punch and roll sequence of my Turkish Get Up, where I am up into that more seated position versus being on my back. From there, then I would lift the hips, bring the straight leg behind me, come to a half kneeling position, and then stand up from there for the full get up. But just for sake of this exercise, the half get up works more specifically core and shoulder stability. So I chose that in between this circuit because, again, on the fly, I just put this together and I figured, okay, I got a heavy bell. I don't have a ton of core exercises that I can do that will stimulate me more than body weight unless I use this heavy bell. And there's not a lot of heavy bell exercises you can use for your core. And I was like, okay, well, the Turkish Get Up, the first half of the Get Up, I could use that for the core. And then I'm like, okay, well, I'm right here. I need to do some sort of hip extension movement. And so I'll do hip thrusts. There's a platform right there. And then, a platform and a heavy bell. I can do some overhead pressing at the same time. So just one piece of gear essentially, and then a platform to put myself on. But that's, again, going back to the intention of these exercises is for you to be able to just plug and play, going somewhere from the 4 to 6 rep range for higher intensity weights and or strength exercises, more in the 6 to 10 rep range for that mid rep range level, and then for some of the more metabolic or pump exercises, potentially bodyweight exercises, you can go from the 10 even up to the 15 rep range as you're going through this hybrid circuit format. But you just choose the reps, choose a lower, an upper, and a core. Doesn't even have to be a lower, an upper, and a core exercise. You can go 2 upper body exercises and a core exercise, or 2 lower body exercises and an arm exercise. You can put that circuit together any way that you want. The idea is to try to get it to be as comprehensive as possible when balancing out the entire week's worth of movements and exercises. So that way you have an optimal and balanced development that will give you the most return on investment for range of motion, control, movement quality, strength, and athletic performance. So I'm just finishing out my third set here of the get-ups. I'm going to record my time at the end of this, and I'm comparing this time to my last time when I went through the circuit. This one I added 1 rep to each, and then my goal is to try to race the clock, essentially, ghost lap myself, and get the same time if possible, or less if I'm really cooking along on the second round through.